known in Hayesville as Blind Jim Penland, who was established the Clay County Telephone Company in 1916 and continued to manage and operate it until World War II days. He had been blinded at the age of 12 in a hunting accident. He had attended the North Carolina School for the Blind in Raleigh, and I suppose that somewhere along that line, while he was in Raleigh, he must have been exposed to a telephone, or one or more telephones, enough to make him curious about it. He was, in spite of the fact that he was blind, he was very mechanically adept, and he was also highly curious about things. So anything that came up in the way of mechanical or scientific or electrical or something like that, he was curious enough that he would ask questions and find out how things worked. Now we're just guessing at this because we don't know what his exposure was to the telephone before the time when the telephone company was started here in Clay County.
Now the telephone company here in Clay County was started 40 years after the invention of the telephone.
Yeah, the telephone was invented in 1876, and in fact, it was first shown publicly at the exposition in Philadelphia in 1876. So this was not too many years after that we had telephones in Clay County. He had been, after he left school, he had lived mostly up on Shooting Creek, which was the family home of our branch of the Penland family. And he'd run a store at Elf and done various other things.
Post office.
Yeah.
Only blind postmaster in the United States or anywhere we know about.
He was your father, wasn't he?
Our father. After the postal inspector came by and found out they had a blind postmaster, they immediately made our mother the postmistress instead. So that solved that problem. Nothing changed. Everything except just the name on the record.
Now she went to state school for the blind too, but she could see some at that time.
In fact, she had an operation sometime later, sometime pretty close to when I was born, a year or two before or after, I forget which. It was before, in which she had quite good vision with heavy glasses until later in life, when she later was totally blind. Anyway, at the time when this telephone situation came up, he was the county treasurer. He was the county treasurer for 2 years, 1914 and 1915. Now, sometime during that period, evidently the idea came up and was discussed of a telephone system in Clay County. At that time, there was one telephone in Clay County. It was located in the commercial hotel. Around here, we've got pictures of the commercial hotel several places. And that was the only telephone in the county. And of course, it was just a line to Murphy for a long distance. So that was all they had. The town of Hayesville was formally established in 1913, and they had their officers, and at the time, in 1915, when this discussion started, the officers were, Will Hunt was the mayor, and the commissioners, I think they were called in, some people referred to them as aldermen. It was
W. Matherson.
Yeah.
J.B. Curtis and D.B. Ketron.
Okay, now to people around Hayesville, the old timers, that was Will Hunt, Luther Madison, Doc Ketron, and Jeb Curtis. And those were fairly prominent people, of course, in Hayesville in those days. And anyway, as the town commissioners, they granted him a franchise on the town of Hayesville. Now, with the plan was that all of the telephones, all of the switchboard, all the equipment within the town would be owned by the Clay County Telephone Company out to the town limits.
With him as president.
Then he proceeded to go up each creek, Shooting Creek, Tusquity, Blair Creek, all of the various streams, and organized the rural people to build their own telephone line. They would own all of their own telephones, and they would own the wire. They would set their own poles and build a line down to the town limits. So they actually, that's the way it worked. They did that. Those people built their lines up to the town limits.
And their old telephones were the old wall type like this.
Focus on this telephone. This was the most common type of telephone that we had. That's the old Western Electric plain front telephone. It was very common in those days and probably cost somewhere around $10.
Very complicated thing for $10.
But it had become common enough by then to where it was they were making them in factories. And if you will notice the woodwork on this telephone, it has dovetail joints at all corners, and it is beautiful woodwork. It's really, really fine woodwork.
And they had batteries, 2 round batteries, about this tall in it.
Dry cell batteries were what we used in this telephone. Now the switchboard was ordered from the Western Electric Company in Atlanta, and we believe that our Uncle Whit Penland, my dad's older brother, went to Atlanta and purchased the switchboard and the wire and the other equipment that was needed, and proceeded to bring that back here to Clay County and for them to start their construction. Uncle Whit also assisted Dad with the installation of that telephone. He read the drawings, the instruction manuals, things like that for him. But Dad did most of that, or a lot of that work of actually doing the installation himself. Now, as I said before, in spite of the fact that he was totally blind, he had good mechanical skills. And in fact, after they had it just about ready to start up, it was finally, the last connections were made and everything to make it run occurred at night. And Uncle Whit had gone home. He wasn't even there. My oldest brother, Eugene, he was 7 or 8 years old at the time. He was acting as the handing them tools and doing the little chores of things that he needed. And Gene says he don't remember ever being as sleepy in his life. Dad kept him up practically all night, handing him tools. Anyway, he at about 7 or 7:30 in the morning, the first telephone call was made to the Willie Price house. The Willie Price house is over on the other side of the river. They had run the wires out of town, down to the river and across the river and over onto the other side to the Willie Price house. And that was the first telephone call. They, of course, in the meanwhile, these other people were building all these lines in all directions. And I don't know who was the second one or the following ones, but at the time when I can start remembering life, the telephone system and our family were just so intermeshed that we were like one. Now, the original location for the telephone office was a building just across the street on the north side where...
On the library, where Neva White now is.
Yeah, across the street from the library on the north side, in the direction of the community building there. And that was where 2 famous things occurred. One was that telephone system started there. The other one was I was born there. The switchboard remained there and was operated strictly by the family.
In the home.
In the home until 1921. In 1921, a new building had been built up on the square, the same location where the Wachovia Bank is now located. This was a two-story building, and the second floor of that building was fixed up with a place for the switchboard, another place for an apartment where someone to live up there. And at that time, Dad hired a lady who is well remembered by the old folks around Haysville, Miss Cora Harden, H-A-R-D-E-N. Miss Cora Harden was an institution in this town for many, many years. She was one of those people who was known as Central, and she was hired as a night operator and bookkeeper. Dad actually operated the switchboard himself during the day and did other things.
Or one of his children.
Or he caught whichever child was handiest and became the operator.
I'd come after school in the afternoons and on Saturdays and Sundays.
And we boys were linemen and other things when we got big enough. I learned to climb poles, and by the time I was 14 years old, I was working telephone lines, helping build them and repair them. That was typical. My oldest brother had been too young at the time when he started to use a regular set of climbers. You've seen the kind of climbers that linemen use. It has a metal strap that goes under the foot and up the leg and is bound around your leg with straps like belts. Has a spur on the inside, and you walk up the pole like sticking spurs into wood. This one pair of climbers that all of us learned on had to be shortened. So all they did was take it down to Mr. Palmer at the blacksmith shop. He proceeded to double that strap over to where instead of it being a 15-inch, which is about the normal length, it was probably about a 12-inch length. And that was the way we boys, as we grew big enough to learn to climb poles, learned to climb our poles. We had them I remember the first one I climbed was over in front of our house over in West Haysville. And I climbed that pole a lot of times.
Well, you hadn't told them that you moved to another location.
Now, at the time the switchboard was moved from the building down across from the library up to the building where the bank is now located, our family moved into a new house over here on the road out toward, it's where, is it Sam Davis?
Sam Davis now.
Where Sam Davis now lives.
Right straight across from our Uncle Sylvie, Penland.
The house that was there sometime many years ago, since the Davises had bought it, was burned and replaced by another house. So the old house is not there any longer. But that's where we grew up there. It was a wonderful place to grow up for many reasons, one of which was that the creek ran right alongside our lot. We could dam up the creek and make swimming holes and do all kinds of things.
I was 10 years old when we moved into that house.
I was less than a year old.
That's right, he was just a baby.
The next person who was hired was many years later as an employee. Other than that, the family did all the work. The next person who was hired as an employee was Wade Palmer, and it was along probably in around, I guess, 1934 or something like that, that he was hired to be a lineman and repairman for the telephone company.
I guess by that time you had lots more telephones.
Oh, yes. In fact, Clay County at one time had the most telephones per capita of any place in the state of North Carolina. And of course, the thing that made that possible were these long lines up every creek. See, Dad's idea was that the telephones will be more beneficial to the people in town, the storekeepers and the people that live in town, if they can contact many people. Now, the many people were up and down all these creeks. And that was the reason he went in for this scheme of them owning their own lines and everything, because that could be done relatively cheaply. And that's the reason we had so many people. And the telephone rates were quite, if you think about it, these were quite reasonable. for a rural resident owning his own phone and so forth up to the town limits, he paid $5 a year. All he was paying for was the switchboard service. Connection. That was his basic rental fee, was $5 per year. Now, the people in town, the residential phone was $1 a year. That was a party line. If you wanted a private line, I think it cost you a little more than that, maybe like $1.50.
It was $1.50.
Businesses for private lines pay $2.50.
A year?
No, I'm sorry, a month. These are all monthly rates.
Oh, I see.
Everything after the original $5 a year for
I
the
see.
now,
We're
people,
all monthly.
in other words, these are telephone rentals comparable to what we pay now.
Well, the $5 was the ones out in the county, not in town.
I see.
And then he had a small, the rate, this rate he's talking about, was the ones in town.
And that was the case where the telephone company owned the telephones, they owned the lines, they owned everything in that. In other words, we merely went out and installed a telephone in someone's house. And the telephone company owned everything in the system. And that was, so these were quite reasonable rates. I remember when I was a teenage boy, I was driving and guiding my dad, and we went into the state utilities office in Raleigh. And the man there told Dad, he says, your rates are not in line. You need to increase your rates. So as we left, got in the car and headed out back towards western North Carolina, I can still remember Dad talking to himself and to me, saying that, you know, he's right. Those rates should be higher than they are. But he says, if I raise those rates, this was Depression years, if I raise those rates, people in Clay County can't afford a telephone. Says there'd be too many of them that just don't have the money to pay for it. I'm not going to raise them. And he didn't. The telephone company proceeded, as I've outlined, until along in the mid-30s, he took a job with the state of North Carolina of rehabilitation of blind people. And when he did, that took him away from, of course, tending the thing every day, but he still kept the telephone company and operated it with hired operators and these kind of things. And I can't remember all of the people who were the hired operators, but there were quite a few of the girls around Hayesville who are now, of course, old ladies who were operators in those days.
And it's after we moved to Asheville.
When we moved, then no, that wasn't after we moved to Asheville. That was before we moved to Asheville. Then when he later just had to move because of his work to Asheville. And when that happened, then he had local people manage the telephone system from then on. And there was a list of people, and I don't remember exactly the order, but I believe the first people were Glenn Prater and Christine. And Christine's still around. Everybody knows Christine. You know Christine Prater, I bet, don't you?
No,
Okay. Then there was Ellie Hollifield, who was her brother. There was George Spur at one time.
And Lizzie.
And our aunt, my mother's sister, Lizzie Curtis, who was later Lizzie Wimby. They were local managers. This went on until the World War II days. Dad still owned the telephone through that. And after World War II, then he sold out. He was living in Asheville, and it was now time to modernize. And he was no longer in a position, and he had reached the age also when he wasn't interested in modernizing to a dial system, which was what was needed at that time. So he sold it out so it could be modernized. So that's the general story of the telephone system.
Well, another thing that we should bring in here is how the people paid
Oh, yeah.
their telephone.
Leader of that list of some of the things.
I'll just give a little bit of things that were paid for telephone rent. Now, at that time, they had a creamery building here. Well, they were wanting to sell out the creamery building. Well, Dad bought the stock in that creamery building, and ones that owned the stock, he gave them credit on their telephone bill for their stock for that at that time. Of course, cash naturally was one way of paying. Another way of paying was people that worked for him, and vegetables like potatoes and both Irish and yams, sweet potatoes, baby chicks, plants, subscription to the Clay County News at that time. He gave the man who was putting out the news credit for his paper to get the paper for his telephone rent. Well, meal, rye, flour, and wheat, clothes, and meats, hams and things like that, and a cow for one thing, and the doctor bills. Now, we had 3, 4 doctors here in town at that time. There was Dr. Killian, Dr. Sullivan, Dr. May, and Dr. O'Neill. Well, neither one of the doctors knew what Dad owed them, and he didn't know what they owed him. They just marked off for each one.
Except for long distance. He
Yeah,
did charge
except
them for
long distance.
Yes.
Naturally, the long distance was that, and they had long distance. And here is sand and cement, shoes, milk and butter, ice, and car hire. Now, that's when he had to hire a car for some reason. Poles to put up on the lines. Also pole wood that these boys could help him saw for the heater. We heated with a heater in our home. And one thing here I have down is 8 pounds of fish. Somebody had gone fishing and he had bought the fish.
Well, let me interrupt there just a moment. There was a man named John Swain, lived over between here and Hiawassee, in that direction, who he and his boys were rabbit hunters. And it was not uncommon in the wintertime for him for them to shoot the rabbits, clean them, and have them ready to eat. And they'd put them in an 8-pound lard pail and bring them up to the telephone office to Dad as payment for the telephone bill. They paid the telephone bill with rabbit meat. And it was good.
And another fella built our dining table as well as 2 library tables.
That was Ed McComb.
Now that was
He
in
was good.
1933. He got credit for his telephone bill. And
Now where she's getting all this information is, we still have copies of some of the old ledger books which Miss Cora Harden kept as to what each person's status was, and how they paid, these kind of things. So she has
I
taken
thought
those.
he was going to bring it, but he
I
forgot.
meant to bring the books. They had 2 books, one for the country rural people and a different one for the town people. They kept 2 ledgers.
Well, another thing was watermelons and apples, grapes, syrup, gas, oil, and people plow their garden, fertilize, and different things like that. Another thing was piano lessons.
Yeah, Miss Edna Anderson.
and voice lessons.
Wow.
So those are just a few of the things.
Those didn't take, by the way, the piano lessons and the voice lessons.
You know what I'd like you to demonstrate that machine and tell us why the bells were on there.
Okay.
All right, now you can take this up and I'll move over to the switchboard.
Well, let's see, just a second before I do. Oh, I can't take it away.
It doesn't have the batteries in it.
Disconnected in there. This was the Henderson Setzer's family,
My
telephone.
husband,
Her husband's telephone.
Oh,
and it belongs to my son.
Now some things that are different about this switchboard from what you think of as those old type with the lights and things is that instead of having a microphone or transmitter mounted on their chest, you see it hang from above like this instead. And you did wear the headphones, however.
Now, if someone called, the little bell would ring.
Now let me point out something else that's interesting about the bells. If he were to hear those bells ring and he was standing out in the hall somewhere, completely away from the telephone, just the sound of each bell, he could tell you which line it was that was ringing.
Whether it was Tusquety line or Shooting Creek line or Elf line or...
There is enough difference in the tones of those bells, even though those bells were, of course, manufactured to be exact duplicates of each other. There's enough difference in the tone that someone, over time, can learn to distinguish all of those little variations in tone.
isn't that remarkable?
It is. It's a remarkable phenomenon from the physics standpoint, and the fact that he could actually do it. But I can assure you that he could, because I have, back when I was a child trying to learn to operate that switchboard,
Well, now we will...
he'd be somewhere else, and he would tell me which line was ringing. I was looking up at it and trying to see which one of those little gadgets was moving back and forth.
We would hear the bell ring. We'll say that it was this line right here ringing. We pick that plug up. We push this in, and we say central into this. Well, they tell us who they want.
Now, they didn't give a number now. They
No,
said,
they
I want
told-
to talk to Ed Meese, or I want to talk to John Tiger.
Or Tiger Store.
Yeah.
All right? To make the connection, you put this in the line that Tiger Store is on. Then you keep this on. Then you take your fingers and mash the little red button
While
turning this. Each telephone had a different ring. It was a 2
Now,
short,
this is party lines we're talking about.
3 shorts, long, short, and a long, or whatever. Well, you rang by how long you kept that. Long, short, long. Then they answered. When they answered, your connection was made, you pull this back. You were ready for the next call, which might be this one. You connect with this, but you can't talk to them until you push that little black button. They go through the same process. Maybe they're calling for this one. You do the same thing with this.
Except you pick the one that's in line with that cord.
That's right. You have to have the one in line.
Well, what if the line was busy?
Well, you'd see it. Oh, if someone were on
Yeah,
that line.
uh-huh.
Okay, when you plug
Yes,
in
sir.
here, you hear people talking on that line
That's right.
But I mean,
And
that
you'd
they-
have
what would you say to the people that were, what would you say?
now. Well, you'd say that line's busy,
Oh, I have it.
and then they would call back in a few minutes.
Now, does each bell stand for a different household or a different area?
Okay, now wait a minute.
The little bells.
Each of these bells stands for a line. Now, if that line went up Shooting Creek, there might be 10 people on it, and that's a party line. And if it went over to Tiger's Store, it probably is a single line. Now, you don't need to worry about shorts and longs and various codes if you are talking to a single line. But if you're talking a party line, you gotta know who's being called, and that's the way it worked. While we're talking about party lines, let me throw in a little extra. Some lines were more party lines than others. The one was my favorite was Tusquity. Of course, those people up and down Tusquity Creek, you know, the houses were stretched up and down the creek, and they didn't see each other frequently. They saw each other at church on Sunday, or if they got together for some reason or other. But anytime a telephone rang, that group of women up and down that creek had a party. Everybody got on the line. And they would talk for a half an hour or an hour if need be, just to, and leave it and come back to it maybe. They'd tell each other how many chickens hatched from their setting of eggs, what they had in the garden, what vegetables were ripe, what was looking good, what the children were doing. They just, everything that they would talk about if they were sitting around in a room sewing together or whatever, they talked about on the telephone. It was a true party line.
Well, you see, if we rang on that line, whoever ring it was, the others knew who was being rung because they knew who was on their line and whose ring it was.
All lines weren't like
and
that.
And they could ring the ones on their line themselves.
I see.
Oh yeah, if they wanted to call a neighbor,
They could do that.
they could just turn the crank long, short, long.
They could listen in and see whether anybody's talking or not before they'd ring.
Well, you know, I know a little something about that. When I was a baby, and we lived in the country in western Pennsylvania, and my mother became very ill, and my father would have to call into town and report what she had was typhoid fever, and he would have to report her condition, and this was a party line. So the whole thing was that all the neighbors would, oh, I must see how she is, you know, and they would go to the telephone. Oh, well, she's better this morning, you know. Yeah. And then if the doctor said, well, she ought to have such and such a broth or something like that, I'll bring that down, Professor, I'll bring that.
Yeah.
that's the way, and I heard about that when I was growing up.
Same thing was happening in western Pennsylvania.
Yes,
I have, as part of my telephone collection in my basement at home, a switchboard that came from a small company in western Pennsylvania. And it's a different type of switchboard entirely from these. It operates entirely with these little switches like that.
It wasn't Old Concord, Pennsylvania, was it?
It wasn't a town at all. It was some small company, and the only way I have of identifying it was that evidently the operator was also probably the receptionist, and I expect the typist too or something. But it has the area code, and this was in use late enough to have an area code on the telephone that she answered with. But it has up over some of the lines things like accounting, plant, Johnson, these kind of things.
There's one incident or two that I want him to tell, and then if he wants to quit, well, okay. But tell them about your leaving your pliers.
Oh, when I was first learning to work on the lines, my older brother Cecil I was with him, and we went up to Elton. It was a real tall pole, and I had to go up and connect the line to an insulator, and I proceeded to put on my belt with all the tools.
That's his first trip.
Climbers. And I'd been practicing on this pole down here in the front yard where I thought I was pretty good. But I still hadn't developed much stamina in that climbing. That's hard work, you know. You got to take your whole weight up there. So I proceeded to climb that pole and do the job up there of what work I needed to do and come down. And I got down and was standing there on the ground, and Cecil says, "Where are your pliers?" I reached for my belt, my pliers weren't there. They're laying on top of that cross arm, on top of that pole. He says, "Now go back and get them." Well, I just about used all the energy I had, but I went back and got those pliers, and I was really tired by the time I got down from this pole. Another little interesting one, this one didn't happen to
That
me.
was a good lesson.
I think it occurred to my oldest brother, Eugene, and I'm not sure which cousin was with him at the time, but I believe maybe Clifton. Anyway, if it wasn't, it was Farrell's. He went up on a pole somewhere here in town, and it was after we had gotten electricity from the dynamo. Has anybody told you about the dynamo yet? Well, first electricity in Hayesville came from a dam which was up about just a little slightly upstream from where the high level bridge is now. You know where that is, up Shooting Creek. And they put in there a generator, which in those days they called a dynamo, and the wires came to Hayesville, and some of the people in Hayesville had electricity. Well, Gene went up this pole, and what he was going to do was work on a wire which went from the main line into someone's house. And he reached up and grabbed a hold of this wire and pulled on it, and over on the other side of the street where it ran under the electric line, it went up into it. Well, you know what the effect of electricity is on it, makes you do this. So there he grabbed this, pulled it, and he couldn't get loose from it because he couldn't, his nervous system was saying, hold on. Well, here he's holding on with his other hand to the pole, and he's stuck like that. Well, Clifton or Farrell, whoever was with him, had to shinny up that pole without any climbers and wrap his legs around the pole and catch him by the rear end and boost him enough to release that wire across the street before he could turn loose of it. Doesn't do any damage.
Now, one more thing, the Carringer home.
Oh, we had one line that kept, it went to the Carringer house.
Charlotte Carringer.
And Charlie lived down on the corner next to where the community center is now, is where the house was. He proceeded to, this line was ringing the bell in the switchboard all the time, and in his house all the time, and they were complaining about that. So there were people at the switchboard. In fact, Dad went over to the arrestor block and removed the arrestor blocks from that line, so that the lightning arrestor block, so that it wouldn't ring in the switchboard all the time. But then he got in touch with me. I don't know what I was doing at the time, but he wanted me to find out what the trouble was. So I went down and talked to Mrs. Carringer. She said they haven't done anything that would connect any electricity to it anywhere. I walked that line. I couldn't figure out where the problem was. So I proceeded to go up on a pole between their house and the switchboard and go up and break the connection, cut the wire, and then I was going to fasten it back again. And in what I had these what we call stretchers, which is what you pull it back together again. I had that on, but I reached over and grabbed, after I cut it apart, I reached over and somehow or other got in contact with both of them, and then I had electricity going to me. Fortunately, I was able to release on this one. I could slide my hand off of it, so I didn't have any problem with it. But anyway, then I fastened it back again, and I went to look. And in the meanwhile, while it was apart, I went back to the telephone office and down to their house, and the problem was on their house end. It wasn't back towards the telephone office anymore. So I knew there was a problem in their house. Proceeded to investigate again to see just what was tied on to what, and I found out that they had grounded their radio to the telephone line. And their radio, the electric power coming into the radio was somehow or other short-circuiting through the ground wire there, and that was what was causing the trouble.
They're using it for an antenna.
No, they was using it for a ground.
Or ground, well, whatever.
You think of any more little stories like that?
Well, I
can
guess
remember
that's
one
a
of the-
sample of
I can
something
remember
like
one of
that.
the coldest experiences in my life was when we had a problem out in the Sweetwater Gap. You are familiar with where Sweetwater Gap is up there. In those days, the main road to Murphy was down by Warren and Ogden, not by Sweetwater. It was just a country road out that way. But there was a telephone line went down there. Well, someone in an automobile had hit the pole out in the gap and dragged the wire, got caught on the bumper or something, way down towards Sweetwater. You know, like several hundred yards, maybe a quarter of a mile. This was in the middle of the winter, and Dad sent me out there to repair that thing. And I spent a cold, cold day trying to drag that wire back and having to rig some kind of a temporary pole to hold it, but that pole had gotten broken and so forth before I ever got home. And I still remember that after all these years as being an excruciatingly painful day when my hands were so cold I could just barely work with the wires.
Well, our number was a long, short, and a long. Our individual.
At our house.
At our home. Today, I live up on the lake. My brothers have trailers up there around. If they are there on weekends or holidays and I want them to come, I just go out and blow my horn on the car, long, short, and long, and they know that
Oh, that's cute.
from me.